in the case of the solar warrior, it's basically, the idea is to synthesize the material and the spiritual, and to create that synthesis first within and then projected into society.
Hi Miguel, I'm really glad to be here again with you and to be talking about this first part of the Solar Warrior, origins, rise and decline, and I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about the general idea behind this first part of your book.
Hi Jan, nice to be with you again. And well, the title of the first book is Origins, Rise and Decline. So basically it is a historical approach to this issue, this archetype of the solar warrior. Basically, in any historic approach, there is the problem that history, it's very chaotic, and we always project into it our own worldviews and our own spirit, our own perspectives about things. So basically, in this case, what I've based the research in the mythical component that allowed me to trace this archetype throughout history. Now, this myth has been expressed itself in many different ways, like in the case of Hercules, like in the case of Horus, the case of Mithra, or even Siegfried and Percival in the Middle Ages. They're all different incarnations of the same principle. So even though we might doubt about the actual existence of these individuals in time and space, definitely these myths are telling us generally about the main characters, the commonalities among all of these figures, and there is definitely commonalities that I trace. So basically, once understood this, I describe the process of how originally this figure was the illuminating figure of many societies and cultures, in the sense of overcoming conflicts and challenges. And then this figure suddenly, it always happened in history because of a process of decline, inevitable. It just remains kind of in the underground of history, and then basically it emerges again, once again, very sporadically, and then it disappears again. So basically I try to trace this coming and going of this figure until the Middle Ages, where I consider that basically the last incarnation of the solar warrior archetype was basically in the Knight Templars and other orders of the Middle Ages. But since then, basically, it was the kind of twilight of that spirit in the West. So basically, I trace the story, the history of that archetype until the until the suppression of the Templars order on the part of Philip IV Fair and Clement V, the Pope at that time. And that's the end of the book.
So what you're saying is that myth really played a critical role in the formation of this first part of the Solar Warrior. And I'm wondering what method you use for approaching the archetype of the Solar Warrior itself.
Well, as said, basically the approach is to try to understand myth. Now, if we try to understand myth rationally, it's just not going to be possible, because myth by its own nature is irrational. But definitely it has a depth embedded that allows it to have a kind of resonance with the soul of these archetypes. So basically, sometimes we use words, we use metaphors, allegories that are not specifically scientific, but it doesn't mean that they're not providing us a very deep feeling of what's going on. It's like these forests. For example, during the last month, there has been this huge power electric company called Swepco, I think it's the name, that has been is attempting to basically destroy the whole forest and install power lines and basically convert this into a huge wire network. And people here are reacting, and some people might even say, oh, this is a monster coming to eat us. Well, of course, it's not strictly scientifically true, but definitely it's defining a state of the spirit of this people, and of course that's basically what I look for when I approach myth. I'm looking for the soul, what they really felt, what was their worldview of, or in this case, the archetype of the solar warrior. So basically, there is a moment in history in which all scientific positivist research just doesn't go anywhere, and then at the end we have to go deeper, 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 and that means to go even deeper into our own selves and our own feelings.
So, Miguel, one of the key points that you make in this book about the solar warrior is that the warrior tradition, you trace it back as being something that came from the pagan cultures. And does that mean that it really doesn't have anything to do with Christianity, as is so often portrayed, for example, in the period of the Crusades and so forth?
Yeah, well, if we go to the origins of Christianity, we can see that basically what is characteristic of it, and especially in the West, in Europe, that is that is something totally alien to pagan Europe, is the fact of this splitting, this gap that Christianity promoted between the natural world and the supernatural world. Since the times of Christianity, it was promoted this idea that the world of God, the world of heavens are not immanent, are not here, but they're in the afterlife. So basically, this is totally in opposition to any existential ethics regarding the solar warrior, because in the case of the solar warrior, it's basically the idea is to synthesize the material and the spiritual, and to create that synthesis first within and then projected into society. Now, of course, if Christianity is promoting very aggressively this idea that there has to be created this split between the supernatural and the natural, well, the solar warrior archetype has to be totally dismissed as something that comes from the devil, something that is pagan, something that has to be forgotten from existence. And that's actually what really happened until there was basically a little renaissance of this idea in the Middle Ages.
So, Miguel, in this book, you bring in the root of paganism in terms of its support of the warrior aspect, and you specifically focus on the Celtic tradition. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, why the Celtic tradition is so important, how it relates to pagan traditions, and why it's so important for us to recover that Celtic spirit today.
Well, in my book, there's a whole chapter dedicated to the pagan worldview, and basically, if I would have to summarize, its core meaning would be basically the total absence of any dualistic or this kind of gap separation between the natural world and the supernatural world. Now, this paganism expressed it in many different forms. There were more, for example, more hierarchical structures like the Celts, and then there were more goddess matriarchal structures that even in the Neolithic times dominated whole Europe. So basically, it has different ways of expressing this main idea that nature has to be honored. Nature all, even the nature of human beings, have to be honored. So it's just precisely upon this worldview and this ethics from which basically any culture can really arise. It's like a soil. The paganism is like a soil that any culture requires in order to grow, and this basically the uh, Celtic civilization or Celtic culture, it arose from a pagan, we can say, soil, and created a whole structure of society that was that integrated many different aspects of the existential living of people. It could even integrate the warrior tradition perfectly well with a very pristine respect to the natural world. So, but yeah, so why is it so important to recover the Celtic worldview today? Because we're living in a world that nature's being destroyed, and there's not going to be any renaissance of any kind if we don't start just thinking about to just care about the natural world. If we don't do that, then nothing can be done. So we can see even in historical times that this was exactly what occurred. So first, before talking about society, before talking about relationships, we have to understand that without this soil, that this planet we are living, nothing's going to exist. So basically, it's important to recover this idea of honoring nature, because but nature at all levels, just not to believe that there is an abstract world beyond us that we can't have any experience of. We have to experience here and now in order to understand the world we're living. So basically, it's important to recover this pagan idea of honoring nature, of respecting nature, because only by this any social, educational, and any kind of consideration about society can start to have some possibilities of success on a community or even at a state level. So basically, if the pagan soil, the pagan ethics are fundamental to recover, and the Celtic spirit is basically the idea of knowing that if we cultivate that, we can certainly integrate many aspects of our life and different cultures, races, ideas, and put them all in a perfect synthesis.
So it occurred to me while you were speaking that this issue of dualism or separation is really one of the critical issues, one of the critical psychological, spiritual, cultural obstacles or factors that has to be overcome if the warrior tradition is to reemerge in our world.
Yes. Well, of course, today we're not in those times where, let's say, Christianity or any belief system has so much power, probably like in other times, even though, of course, it's still there. But definitely there are many other forms of dualism. Let's say, just for example, um, uh, just watching TV and creating a world of spectacle and shows that have nothing to do with our existential reality. That's a form of dualism that today we accept, even though we might even think we're atheists. So there are many different expressions of this dualism, even in our world, and basically, that's one of the, the issues that I explain throughout the whole collection. That basically Christianity was basically the first clear example of this strict separation between our world, our experience, and the different layers of the metaphysical world that can be achieved through integrating those experiences. So yeah, basically dualism today, it's still there, and we just have to be aware of it.
Miguel, one of the most surprising ideas, at least to me, that you present in this first part of the book is the idea that the Middle Ages were in fact an age of great light and illumination, and that they were in no way the Dark Ages that we are traditionally led to believe. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, we've been taught, well, basically the label of the Middle Ages is the Dark Ages. Yeah, we know that we've all been taught this. But yeah, we have to understand that definitely it's, as I said at the beginning, we are just looking in history, projecting ourselves in history, and of course, basically, of course, if I'm every single day with my smartphone and I think that I see a light in the smartphone, then I would say, oh yeah, the Middle Ages, the people in the Middle Ages, they didn't have any smartphones, so they were not enlightened as we thanks to our smartphones. Of course, it's easy to think that, but definitely, if we look a little closer to the fact that basically the worldviews that existed at that time in a very specific minority elite of, and when I talk about elite, I'm not talking in an elitist way. Basically, I'm saying that there was at that time uh, some initiates who were able to see the world with different eyes. Now, the world was in the Middle Ages was absolutely barbarian, chaotic, and definitely dark times. I mean, there was even the the, many illnesses, many violence, and everything. But basically, it was not so much about the external world, but the eyes that could see the world. And definitely, from that viewpoint, people, there were specific groups of individuals who could see the world with different eyes, and because they were persecuted by the Inquisition, those eyes disappeared basically from history. So basically, that's what I trace in this book, all this disappearance of this way of looking at things, and not so much as the things themselves.
There's a contradiction that I see in the book that I'm hoping that you could talk a little bit about, Miguel. It has to do with the Knight Templars and the presentation that you give that they are really the embodiment of the solar warrior and free from this dualism. And at the same time, they are presented in history as really being critical to the Christian Crusades. And that is, you frame them in that way somewhat in your book, that they were very much involved in the Crusades. So how do we deal with that contradiction? What do you have to say about it?
Yes, well, I mean, the Knight Templars as an order, it became very big. It even attained up to 70,000 members. So basically, there could have been all kind of different agendas from the different levels of that structure and that order. But what is interesting to me is basically that at a core level, at the spirit that basically directed the order, in specifically the elite of the order, was in no way Christian. Now, how can I come up with this? Well, basically, as I said before, if we look at the myths that and the legends and the saga that emerged specifically in that historical moment, we would see that basically the Grail legends that were very that correspond basically to the Templar spirit, they have absolutely no Christian elements in them. Now, of course, centuries later, the Grail legends became Christianized, and you can see churches, you can see all kind of different elements that are purely Christian. But in that specific moment of the 13th century, you can see that there is no Christian element. Now, as we said before, that can give you an insight into the soul, the agenda, and the spirit of what the core elements of the Templar order would truly believing. And of course, it was totally in opposition to the agenda of Christianity, and probably, and not very probably, but very likely, that's the cause of the final conflict between the Knight Templar Order, the papacy in Rome, and basically Philip IV, the Fair, who was basically implementing a secular state in France, where basically he was going to use Christianity as the main form of propaganda. So we have to distinguish very clearly in the Templars what was the kind of the official aspect of their accomplishments, and then of course the inner, esoteric, and deeper meanings that they were portraying.
Miguel, why was the myth of the Grail so important to the Templars?
You saying it, definitely it was a myth, it was a legend, and if we look in our world today, even though we live in a non-mythical world, well, that's what we tend to believe, this thing of economic growth that can be totally demonstrated that in a finite planet, it just doesn't make sense. Now, it doesn't matter. The world as a whole believes it. So that's the power of myth. And the case of the Knight Templars, or all other orders, or even other knighthood groups in the Middle Ages, they felt that the Grail myth and legend was talking to their spirit, to their soul, and it was telling them things that they existentially could recognize their experience. And especially it was an experience in which honor and the idea of a quest of self-overcoming one's own limitations and the most vile and malicious tendencies was perfectly expressed in the Grail legends. So it was a way of self-recognizing their path and at what stage they were at the different levels of such path. Now, it doesn't really matter if this whatever Grail existed or not. At least they believed it, and that was what allowed them to keep on their mission.
In this book, The Origins, Rise, and Decline, you put forth the idea that the destruction of the Templar elite by the papacy and by the French monarchy was one of the most, if not the most, significant points of destruction in human history. Perhaps even more significant than the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Why do you make that assertion?
Well, I wouldn't say in the whole world human history, but I would definitely say that in the West during the last 2 millennia, it was a key point in the sense that, of course, dualism, as we've been talking about, was definitely something that created a split between the natural world and the metaphysical transcendent domain. But what happened with the suppression of the Templar Order is that basically this split was kind of officialized at the level of the state, because the Templars were acquiring a lot of power and they were competing against secular institutions or secularized institutions like the French monarchy that was totally in a state of decline at a spiritual level, and even the papacy was already unable to cope with many forces that were happening already at that time in the Western world. So basically, the suppression of the Templars was like saying, okay, if there was any possibility of bridging this gap, this is not going to happen, and it's not going to be imprinted at the level of the state. So basically what happened after that is that basically the bourgeois class took over all the structures and all domains of knowledge, science, philosophy, art in society. And of course, suddenly the warrior, the solar warrior tradition became a total eclipse. Everything just became a reflection of it. But it became more and more difficult to go to the source, because the state powers themselves were promoting all kind of bourgeois values that by definition are practically totally incompatible with any solar warrior tradition. Now, the case of the death of Christ, well, yeah, that was an event that was kind of used by Paul the Tarsus, basically in order to start creating the church institution and the church as a form of state. But really, it didn't cause such a tipping point in the sense of changing the cultural traits as like happened with the suppression of the Templars. Just after the Templars, modern science started to arise through figures like Descartes or even Francis Bacon 2 centuries later. So basically, there was a very important change that after the first century, um, after the death of Christ, it's difficult to see these changes. It's very difficult to see. So I would say that definitely, in my opinion, there is much more importance in that sacrifice of Jacques de Molay in Paris in 1314 than basically the death of Christ.
So there are some accounts of the Templars that say that they actually engaged in heretic actions and actions that some people today might find despicable, and yet they have a very predominant and almost, I guess we could say, heroic place in this book. What can you say about that?
Yes, well, they were definitely not saints. Um, um, for them, sanctity was the final stage of a heroic task, a heroic path. It was not something given by just a rite or sacrament. It was something that had to be conquered. Sanctity had to be conquered. Now, in order to conquer sanctity, they had to be worthy of that condition. And that required that basically they had to, as we said before, honor in themselves and in the nature around them all of the different tendencies and aspects of it, but without any sense of attachment. So, of course, even in the Middle Ages, there is this expression like, "Oh, to drink like a Templar." Well, of course, they got very drunk, but the worthiest of the elite, Templar elite were able to experience the inebriation or any kind of passion, anger, hatred, envy, but overcome them and spiritualize, synthesize a new kind of medicine out of that poison. So basically, that connects their rites to very ancient pagan practices, and that were basically about self-overcoming the lowest aspects of the human condition. Now, if on any of those knights could achieve that state we could consider it to be a saint, heroic state. But definitely, it was a process, and in the middle of the path, there could be all kind of things that would cause horror to anybody. But they assumed that life has light, but it also has darkness. So that kind of realism was what allowed them to see the difference.
There are some depictions of the Middle Ages as being a very romantic time, and I'm wondering if you could speak to the idea of knights and knighthood as being imbued with a devotion to women and a love of women.
Yeah, well, of course, there's been transmitted a lot of stereotypes, probably about those ages. If we look at a large scale, the Middle Ages, the relationships between man and woman were kind of brutal, really. They were not kind of very, what we would consider today to be romantic. But definitely, yeah, what has been transmitted to us from those ages are all these courtly love, the fidelity amor, all these kind of traits of the fidelity of the knight towards a specific woman, practically honoring her and offering his victories to her and all this stuff. Yeah, well, that's one aspect of it, but deep down, the fact of the woman emerging as a figure in the mythical aspect of the Middle Ages is always related to the concept of honor on the part of the knight. Now, every time we see the concept of honor, there is always a link to a relation or a potential danger or potential power coming from woman. So woman is always a key aspect in the mythical component of these times. Now, deep down, it was nothing to do with any kind of just platonic devotional aspect. That's just an interpretation. I just think that just doesn't fit those ages. But it was much more about understanding that in the moments of danger and chaos, there are specific feminine figures that have the power, and even the Templars themselves, even when they were imprisoned, the elite in Paris, they were drawing in the walls of the prison the images of the Roman goddess Venus Vitrix, because they were absolutely convinced that only her could save them from condemnation. They didn't care about the social condemnation. They didn't care about the condemnation from the papacy. They didn't care about the condemnation from Philip the Fair or the monarchy. They didn't really care about all these condemnations. They just didn't want to be condemned by Venus Vitrix. That was basically the power they could perceive in those states of danger. So basically, that's the initiatic aspect of the woman in the Middle Ages.
You end this part of the Solar Warrior with the sacrifice of Jacques de Molay in Paris. And I'm wondering if this sacrifice was basically the decline, the end of the solar tradition, the Solar Warrior tradition.
Yeah, well, that was a huge change in many aspects. As I said before, it was the took over basically of the bourgeois class in state affairs in the West. Of course, the Eastern world had, of course, different things going on at that time. But basically, in the spiritual center of gravity of the states, let's say in Europe, definitely there was this took over of the bourgeois class at all levels of society. Now that changed everything. Basically, even the concept of war since then lost any trace of any sacred character. Since then, basically, it became since then wars for the sake of resources, for the sake of individual interests, of competition. The market was established, and that changed the rules of everything too. So basically, things just changed. It was the eclipse of the solar warrior tradition, and even men as insightful as Miguel de Cervantes in Spain wrote fantastically well about the case of Don Quixote, who was basically trying to recover in his own life those ideals, but everybody was just laughing at him, like saying, "You're absolutely crazy. We don't need knighthoods anymore. We don't need this kind of ideals of honor. All this thing is just rusty. We don't need none of that." So basically, that was the main state of spirit in Europe after the 14th, 15th century. It was like saying all that stuff just belongs to a time that is totally dark for us. So basically, yeah, any mention to honor, any mention even to war started to become, but sacred war started to become totally forgotten. So yeah, that was definitely, I would say, the tipping point of the solar warrior tradition in the West. And of course, some people say that even the the Teutonic Prussian warriors that even disappeared like a century ago um, still kind of reenacted that spirit. I don't think so, because I don't see the mythical element in all their actions. So basically, I would say it was definitely the 13th century, 14th century, when the traces of this ideal had been definitely historically lost.
Miguel, thanks so much for talking with me today about this first part of the solar warrior. And we're going to, I guess, be having another conversation about part 2, the eclipse, and I look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks, Jan. It was a pleasure to talk to you about this book.
Thanks for listening to our conversation today, and I hope you'll take a look at our next video in which we talk about the second part of this book, and that second part is called The Eclipse.
The Solar Warrior Trilogy is already available in your main book retailers. Please visit thesolarwarrior.com and take the opportunity to participate in the book Trilogy social networks. And let the solar light be with you. Let the Solar Warrior Trilogy be with you.